what is the virtue of chastity? Okay, so St. Thomas says it's really the virtue that allows us to moderate the desire for sexual pleasure according to principles of faith and reason. And it's a sub-virtue of temperance. Temperance is one of the 4 cardinal or natural virtues that you can think of as helping us to moderate our concupiscible desires, our desires for things that are pleasurable, okay? And a good image for this is to think of water. Okay, so if you just had a big flat surface like the desert, water goes there and it goes everywhere and it evaporates, okay? It doesn't have anything that's channeling it. The virtue of temperance acts as that channel to help guide our desires in the right way. And so in particular, chastity helps us to guide that desire for sexual pleasure, that sexual drive, okay? And we have to understand 2 things about this. One, this underlying desire is natural, meaning that God instilled it in us. However, we have a fallen nature. This is really important in the modern world. There's a lot of emphasis on this humanistic mindset where we emphasize the good in human nature without recognizing that we are fallen. We are fallen beings, and we have concupiscence, where we have a disordered inclination to these sins and these pleasures of our body, especially in the context of lust. Okay? And so while there's this inherent good there is a real distortion that has taken place. And we have to come from this mindset to really understand what it takes to be chaste. Now, in this, again, we don't want to just talk about platitudes. I think it's helpful from time to time to consider the disgust we should have with living outside of the right order that God has established for us. That this desire has its rightful place in the context of holy matrimony when it's connected to the procreative end, right? And when it's outside of that context, we should have a healthy disgust. Not of the inherent desire, but because it is disordered outside the context that God has oriented it around. Even from a psychological level, they say when you're trying to establish a habit, if you consider 2 things. One, the disgust of what will happen if you continue going down this route. And then the great desire you should have if you continue in the route of the habit you're trying to develop. In this case, it has to do with chastity and lust. Because the reason why I think this is helpful is because what I've seen is people live a wayward lifestyle, let's say. And after they've been living like that, they realize, wait a second, this is wrong, this is vapid, I want to live for God. They go the other direction, but they don't integrate what it means to live a holistic life. And so they're just seeing, this is a bad thing over here, I'm going to try to avoid it out of fear, but they haven't, one, developed a disgust of like, that is actually not desirable. It's not just I'm running away from the desire, it's actually something I should have disgust toward. But then 2, what is the flip side of that I'm running toward? The desire of a good life. And so that's how we should contextualize chastity. It's in the context of virtue. Okay, virtue in the classical sense has to do with eudaimonia in the Greek sense, which means flourishing, human flourishing. Okay? And what I found is when you have that as the ideal, then chastity makes sense in that context, right? But if you're only looking at, here's the impure thing I'm running away from, I don't see the good or bad, then oftentimes people just crack. And it's just a matter of white knuckling, crack, white knuckling, crack. And while we're going to get into practicals of how to really avoid as much as possible the occasions of sin and all that, keeping this context, I can't stress how important I found it to be to really imagine what is the ideal of virtue I'm striving for, where it's not just I'm following rules, but it's a desirable life that serves God and glorifies God, right? Like, think about that. What is the ideal virtuous life you're trying to live? It should be something that inspires you and creates a desire to live that way, not just a stale, like, I'm following these rules or whatever. Okay? Now, when it comes to chastity, something else it helps us with is the sense of integrity. It helps us be integral with our desires, and it helps us be integral in our society of how we relate to other human beings. It allows us to see the dignity that is inherent to us, made in the image of God as rational beings. And it allows us to see that someone else is not just to be a tool that I'm going to use for my own pleasure, right? A quick note on that, going back to the topic of pornography and self-pleasure, which is very common today, especially for men, but it's not just men. This is connected to a vice that isn't talked about a lot. Maybe it's because the vice in certain contexts is called effeminacy. It doesn't mean that women always have this vice, but it's another word for it is softness. Okay, it's the vice that's opposed to perseverance. Basically, what this vice does is it makes you attached to a pleasure or a good or comfort, such that you can't try to do what is good because you sorrow too much for losing that comfort. Okay, that's what you can think of softness, right? And when you abuse this desire and self-pleasure, it creates a vicious cycle of needing some comfort and not being able to say no to that comfort. And I think this is one clear connection why our society has such a problem with the LGBTQ whatever and the rampant homosexuality, just to call it out, right? It creates this cycle of pleasure, softness, not striving for things that are difficult, not striving for virtue, because there is arduous good, there's difficulty in that. And it's really important, especially in the context of when you're trying to see the dignity of someone else and love them as yourself. You are incapable of doing that when you're so attached to these pleasures yourself. Okay? And so you end up dehumanizing other people. Right? And so the flip side of that is a truly chaste mindset gives us the freedom to have true, authentic charity. First of all, to love God spiritually, but also to see the image of God in others and to love them authentically where I don't see them as a tool. And so that's a larger context of charity that I'm not going to dive into. But in this realm of chastity in particular, it really is a matter of fighting. You can think of it for the love of God and the love of other souls, because it will prevent you from being able to really love and see the good of others if you fall into this vicious cycle that lust leads to.